On the night of January 26, 2022, 24-year-old Alexis Gabe leaves her home in Oakley, California, and drives toward Antioch. Before leaving, she exchanges casual messages with friends and family. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. According to investigators, Alexis was planning to meet with her ex-boyfriend, Marshall Jones. It would be the last confirmed time anyone heard from her. And then, silence. No phone calls. No activity on her social media accounts. No contact with family. By the next morning, the people closest to Alexis know something is wrong. Because disappearing without explanation was not normal for her. Days later, police locate Alexis Gabe's car abandoned in Oakley. The keys are still inside. Investigators later say the vehicle appears to have been cleaned. But despite those efforts, detectives recover evidence they believe points toward foul play. Evidence that would slowly transform a missing persons investigation into a homicide case. As detectives reconstruct Alexis' final movements, the investigation begins stretching far beyond Contra Costa County. Search teams focus on isolated wilderness areas in Northern California. At the same time, authorities are building a case against the men believed to have been the last person to see Alexis alive. But before an arrest can happen, that man disappears. According to law enforcement, Marshall Jones flees California while investigators prepare murder charges. And after authorities track him to Washington state, the case takes another violent turn. But even after his death, investigators say he left behind something deeply disturbing. Handwritten notes. Directions. Information authorities believe was connected to the disposal of Alexis Gabe's remains. Tonight, we examine the disappearance of Alexis Gabe, the investigation that followed, and the evidence prosecutors say revealed what happened after she vanished. This is the story of Alexis Gabe. And the deeper investigators looked, the darker the case became. He escaped before arrest, but left behind evidence nobody expected. Welcome back to Dark Case Files, where we dig beneath the headlines to uncover the full story behind some of the world's most disturbing crimes. Before we begin, a content note. Today's case involves violence, homicide, and discussions of human remains. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, to understand what happened, you first need to understand who Alexis Gabe was. Alexis Gabe was 24 years old. Friends and family described her as outgoing, humorous, and deeply caring toward the people closest to her. She loved music, fashion, makeup, and spending time with family members. According to loved ones, Alexis had a personality that naturally drew people toward her. She was expressive, social, the kind of person who checked in on others. And that's part of why her disappearance triggered concern so quickly. Because silence from Alexis was unusual. Her father, Gwyn Gabe, would later become one of the most visible voices connected to the case. In interview after interview, he pleaded for answers. He organized volunteer search efforts across Northern California. He handed out flyers, spoke to reporters, and repeatedly promised he would not stop searching for his daughter. As weeks turned into months, the Gabe family became the emotional center of the investigation. Not because they wanted public attention, but because they believed keeping Alexis' name visible might help bring her home. At the time Alexis disappeared, she was living in Oakley, California, a suburban city in Contra Costa County, located east of San Francisco. Oakley was known more for quiet neighborhoods and growing families than violent crime headlines. It was the kind of community where people noticed unfamiliar cars parked on their street. The kind of place where a missing persons case immediately spread through neighborhood groups, local news stations, and social media pages. And in January of 2022, life there seemed relatively normal. But behind the scenes, Alexis was dealing with a relationship that investigators would later place under intense scrutiny. Her ex-boyfriend, Marshall Curtis Jones. According to investigators and public reporting, the two had broken up before Alexis vanished. But despite the breakup, they still remained in contact. At first, nobody around them appeared to realize that relationship would soon become central to a homicide investigation. Because on January 26, 2022, Alexis Gabe disappeared without explanation. And within days, investigators would begin uncovering evidence suggesting this was never simply a missing persons case. Something violent had happened. And detectives were about to begin following a trail that stretched far beyond Oakley, into remote wilderness areas, and toward a suspect already preparing to flee. In the weeks leading up to January 2022, Alexis Gabe was trying to move forward with her life. Like many people in their 20s, she was balancing relationships, future plans, work, friendships, and the everyday stress that comes with adulthood. Family members later said Alexis stayed in close contact with the people she loved, especially her father, Gabe. That detail would become critically important later. Because according to investigators and family members, disappearing without contacting anyone simply was not like her. When adults voluntarily walk away from their lives, they usually leave something behind. A bank transaction, a social media login, a phone call, a text message. But after January 26, 2022, Alexis Gabe seemed to vanish completely. At the center of Alexis' personal life was her former boyfriend, Marshall Curtis Jones. According to investigators, the two had previously been in a relationship before eventually breaking up. Public reporting later described the relationship as complicated. Friends and family members would later suggest there had been tension between them, though many details remained private. Despite the breakup, Alexis continued communicating with Marshall. At the time, nobody around them appeared to recognize just how significant that relationship would soon become. Then came Wednesday, January 26, 2022. What investigators would later call Alexis Gabe's last confirmed day alive. That evening, Alexis leaves Oakley and drives toward Antioch, California. Authorities later determined she was heading to Marshall Jones' residence. According to investigators, Alexis arrives there sometime that night. And after that, her digital trail begins to disappear. Phone activity connected to Alexis reportedly stops. Friends and family begin reaching out to her, but receive no response. At first, the silence seems unusual. Then it becomes alarming. Hours pass. Then an entire night. By the next morning, concern inside the Gabe family is growing rapidly. Because Alexis was known for staying in touch. According to family members, ignoring calls and messages for long periods of time was out of character for her. As attempts to contact Alexis continue failing, loved ones begin trying to piece together her last movements. Who had she seen? Where had she gone? Who was the last person with her? Again and again, investigators and family members arrive at the same answer. Marshall Jones. Soon, Alexis is officially reported missing. And almost immediately, family members begin searching on their own. Flyers appear across Oakley and Antioch. Photos of Alexis spread through social media. Community volunteers join organized search efforts. Her father speaks publicly, urging anyone with information to come forward. But as days pass without answers, fear begins replacing hope. At first, investigators approach the case cautiously. Adults disappear all the time. Some leave voluntarily. Some cut off communication temporarily. And in the earliest stages of a missing persons investigation, detectives have to consider every possibility. But one detail quickly stands out. Alexis had left behind parts of her normal routine. According to investigators and family members, there was no sign she planned to disappear. No warning. No explanation. No indication she intended to walk away from her life. And the longer Alexis Gabe remained missing, the more detectives began to suspect this was not a disappearance at all. Someone, investigators believed, was hiding the truth. And very soon, the investigation would uncover evidence suggesting Alexis had never made it home from Antioch. As word of Alexis Gabe's disappearance spreads, the response is immediate. Search parties begin forming across Contra Costa County. Volunteers walk neighborhoods, parks, and open spaces, calling her name, handing out flyers, and checking surveillance cameras wherever they can gain access. Local businesses tape Alexis' face to their windows. Gas stations, grocery stores, community centers. Her image becomes impossible to miss across Oakley and the surrounding cities. Flyers multiply within days. Black and white photographs of Alexis Gabe appear on street poles, telephone posts, and community boards. Missing. Last seen January 26. Please help. Each copy represents a growing sense of urgency. Because at this point, no one knows whether Alexis is safe or in danger. In the middle of it all is her father, Gabe. He becomes a constant presence in the search effort, speaking to local news stations, coordinating volunteers, walking search routes himself. In interviews, he repeatedly expresses the same message. He just wants his daughter home, no matter what. And the emotional weight of those early days begins to spread through the community. Because the longer Alexis remains missing, the more hope begins to fade. Meanwhile, investigators begin working the case from a different angle. They review Alexis' last known movements, her communications, her contacts, her timeline. And one name appears repeatedly in the early investigation: Marshall Curtis Jones. According to reports, Alexis was last known to have gone to see him in Antioch. At this stage, investigators are careful. They do not publicly label him a suspect. But internally, his name becomes significant. Because detectives begin noticing inconsistencies. When questioned, accounts linked to Marshall Jones reportedly do not fully align with verified timelines. Certain details shift. Explanations change. And investigators begin documenting gaps in the story that do not make sense. There are also reports of limited cooperation during early questioning, which only deepens concern among investigators. Still, publicly, police remain cautious. No charges are filed. No arrest is announced. But behind the scenes, the focus of the investigation is beginning to narrow. Then comes a breakthrough that changes everything. Alexis Gabe's vehicle is located in Oakley. Abandoned. Not in a remote hiding place. Not in a difficult-to-access area. But left in a location that immediately raises questions for investigators. Because it is not just that the car is found. It is how it is found. The keys are still inside. The vehicle appears staged in a way that suggests someone wanted it discovered. And that alone shifts the tone of the investigation. Forensic teams move in quickly. They process the vehicle carefully, documenting every surface, every detail, every trace of potential evidence. And what they begin to recover inside the car changes the entire direction of the case. What initially looked like a missing persons investigation now begins to resemble something far more serious. Because investigators are no longer asking if Alexis Gabe is missing. They are beginning to ask what happened to her inside that vehicle. And who was responsible for what came after. It was January 29, 2022. 3 days after Alexis Gabe vanished without explanation. Police locate her vehicle in Oakley, California. The discovery immediately draws a heavy law enforcement presence to the area. The car is not hidden. It is parked in a way that appears almost deliberate in its normalcy, like it was meant to blend in just long enough to avoid immediate detection. But it didn't. Inside the vehicle, investigators find Alexis' personal belongings still present. The keys are still inside. Nothing about the scene suggests a typical voluntary disappearance. Instead, detectives describe it as unsettling. Too controlled in some areas. And too careless in others. The kind of inconsistency that often signals something went wrong quickly. When Alexis' family arrives at the scene, the emotional weight becomes overwhelming. Her father, Gabe, is visibly distraught. What was once a search effort driven by hope now begins shifting toward fear. Because the car is no longer a clue that she might be found. It is becoming a piece of evidence in something far more serious. Forensic teams begin a full examination of the vehicle. They document every surface. They collect trace evidence. And according to later law enforcement statements, investigators recover biological material inside the car that does not belong to Alexis. DNA evidence becomes a critical turning point. Because it suggests another person was present in the vehicle under circumstances that cannot be easily explained. This is the moment the investigation changes direction. What was once treated as a missing persons case is now escalated into a suspected homicide investigation. Detectives begin reconstructing Alexis Gabe's final movements in detail. Phone records are analyzed. Her last communications are mapped minute by minute. Surveillance footage from Antioch and surrounding areas is collected and reviewed. Investigators track vehicle movement patterns. Digital data is pulled from devices and accounts connected to the case. Every piece of information begins feeding into a single timeline. As the reconstruction develops, one name becomes central to the investigation: Marshall Curtis Jones. Investigators begin focusing heavily on his actions in the hours surrounding Alexis' disappearance. His timeline, his movements, his statements, and the inconsistencies that emerge when those elements are compared to verified evidence. At the same time, detectives conduct interviews with people connected to both Alexis and Marshall. Friends, associates, anyone who might help clarify the timeline. But instead of eliminating uncertainty, the investigation becomes more complex. As the search intensifies, investigators expand their focus beyond urban areas. Attention shifts toward remote regions of Northern California. Eventually, search teams begin concentrating efforts in parts of Amador County. Rugged terrain, dense forest, isolated ground where evidence could remain hidden for long periods of time. And according to investigative reporting, the reason for this focus is deeply disturbing. Authorities believe evidence suggests Alexis Gabe may have been transported to this area after her disappearance. Search operations begin in difficult conditions. Teams comb through wilderness areas methodically, looking for anything that could confirm what investigators fear. But even as those searches unfold, the case takes another unexpected turn. Because while law enforcement is working through remote terrain in Northern California, Marshall Curtis Jones is no longer where investigators expect him to be. He disappears. Authorities begin preparing an arrest warrant as evidence continues to build. But before law enforcement can move in, Jones flees California entirely. And just like that, the case escalates from a homicide investigation into a manhunt. The person at the center of the inquiry is no longer within reach. And investigators are left with mounting evidence, a growing list of unanswered questions, and a suspect who is running out of time, yet still managing to stay ahead of them. With Marshall Curtis Jones now on the run, the investigation escalates beyond local law enforcement. The U.S. Marshals Service is brought in to assist with the search. What was once a regional missing persons case has now expanded into a multi-state manhunt. Investigators begin tracking movement patterns tied to Jones, piecing together sightings, digital traces, and leads that stretch far beyond California. Eventually, the search leads authorities north. Washington state becomes the focal point. Detectives believe Jones may have crossed state lines in an attempt to avoid arrest and disrupt the investigation. Law enforcement agencies coordinate across jurisdictions, tightening the net. But despite the pressure, Jones continues to evade capture. As news of the manhunt spreads, public attention intensifies. Local and national media begin covering the case. Alexis Gabe's name trends across social platforms. People follow updates in real time, trying to understand how a missing persons case escalated into a nationwide search for a suspect accused of murder. With each new development, public concern grows. And so does speculation. Online discussions begin to circle the same questions. Where is Jones now? How did he leave so quickly? And what really happened to Alexis Gabe? Then, investigators make a discovery that changes the tone of the entire case. After Jones flees, authorities reportedly uncover handwritten notes connected to him. Not casual writing. Not personal reminders. But structured notes. Directions. Landmarks. Specific instructions. According to investigative reporting, these notes are believed to reference locations tied to the disposal of Alexis Gabe's remains. The implications are immediate and disturbing. Because this is no longer just about disappearance. It suggests planning. Forethought. A deliberate attempt to conceal what happened after Alexis vanished. And investigators begin to believe these notes may represent a trail, one that could lead directly to answers they have been searching for since January 26. For those working the case, the discovery is difficult to process. Because it reframes everything. It is no longer just about identifying a suspect. It is about understanding intent. What happened? How it happened? And how much effort was taken afterward to hide it? For Alexis Gabe's family, the emotional toll deepens with every update. Hope has long since shifted into grief in progress. But the details emerging from the investigation bring a different kind of pain. Not just the loss itself, but the growing realization of what investigators believe was done afterward. As law enforcement continues to piece together the evidence, one conclusion becomes increasingly clear. Authorities now believe they know who is responsible for Alexis Gabe's disappearance and death. But justice has not yet been served. Because the suspect remains at large. Still mobile. Still unaccounted for. And still considered dangerous. And as investigators close in on what they believe are the final pieces of the puzzle, the case reaches a turning point where everything depends on one question. Will they find Marshall Curtis Jones before he disappears for good? Or will the truth about what happened to Alexis Gabe remain hidden forever? By mid-2022, investigators publicly identify Marshall Curtis Jones as the primary suspect in the disappearance and murder of Alexis Gabe. What began as a missing persons case has now become a full homicide investigation centered on a single name. And according to law enforcement reporting, that conclusion was built on multiple converging points of evidence. Jones was identified as the last known person to see Alexis alive. Investigators examined forensic evidence recovered from Alexis' vehicle. They reconstructed a timeline that placed Jones with Alexis on the night she disappeared. They analyzed travel patterns and movements following her last known contact. And they documented inconsistencies in statements connected to the early stages of the investigation. There were also concerns raised about behavior described by investigators as suspicious in the days after Alexis went missing. Taken individually, each detail might not have been definitive. But together, they formed a pattern investigators could not ignore. Publicly, Marshall Jones did not present himself as a suspect in the early stages. But behind the scenes, investigators were building a case that increasingly pointed in his direction. And as pressure intensified, the situation took a sudden turn. Authorities located Jones in Washington state. A multi-agency effort involving U.S. Marshals began moving in to execute an arrest. This was expected to be the moment the investigation finally reached its conclusion. Instead, it became something far more violent. According to official reports, when law enforcement attempted to apprehend him, Marshall Jones confronted officers with a knife. A confrontation followed. Officers opened fire. Marshall Curtis Jones was killed at the scene. Before he could be taken into custody. Before he could stand trial. Before he could answer the questions investigators had been building for months. And just like that, the only person investigators believed could fully explain what happened to Alexis Gabe was gone. With the primary suspect deceased, the case shifted once again. Now, attention moved beyond one individual and into wider public speculation. Online discussions exploded with theories. Some focused on whether Jones acted alone. Others questioned whether anyone helped him after Alexis disappeared. And a smaller portion of speculation even raised concerns about whether anyone in his immediate circle had knowledge of what happened. Investigators, however, maintained caution. Authorities later stated there was insufficient evidence to charge other individuals connected to the case. No additional arrests were made. No accomplices were formally identified. But public curiosity did not disappear. It only intensified. Through all of it, Alexis Gabe remained at the center of the case. Her name continued to appear in search efforts, news updates, and community posts. Volunteers never fully stopped looking in the early months of the investigation. And her family continued pushing for answers even as the case grew colder in terms of active leads. Her father, Gwyn Gabe, remained one of the most visible voices throughout the entire ordeal. In emotional public statements, he made one thing clear. He was not focused on headlines. He was not focused on attention. He only wanted his daughter brought home. And he wanted the truth about what happened to her to be fully understood. Months later, investigators confirmed a devastating development. Human remains were discovered in Amador County. Forensic analysis and dental records later confirmed the remains belonged to Alexis Gabe. For the first time since her disappearance, there was physical confirmation of what investigators had long believed. But even in that moment, closure did not fully arrive. Because the recovery was incomplete. Not all of Alexis' remains were ever found. And because the primary suspect had died before trial. Many of the most critical questions in the case were never tested in court. No cross-examination. No jury verdict. No full legal resolution. And what remains is a case that investigators consider largely solved. But never fully concluded. Because while authorities believe they understand what happened to Alexis Gabe, the complete truth was never spoken in a courtroom. And some answers may never be recovered at all. In November 2022, authorities confirmed that partial human remains recovered in Amador County belonged to Alexis Gabe. The identification is made through forensic analysis and dental records. For Alexis' family, the announcement carries two realities at once. Relief. Because after months of searching, uncertainty, and fear, Alexis has finally been found. And devastation. Because the discovery confirms what they had already begun to suspect long before the official confirmation. That Alexis was never coming home the way they had hoped. Law enforcement agencies later state that the investigation has reached a conclusion in terms of identifying the responsible party. Investigators outline what they believe happened based on accumulated evidence. Surveillance data. Forensic findings. Digital records. Timeline reconstruction. And recovered physical evidence. All of it, according to investigators, points to the same conclusion. Marshall Curtis Jones is identified as the individual responsible for Alexis Gabe's death. However, Northwest criminal trial takes place. Because the suspect is already deceased. Prosecutors do not present a case in court. There is no courtroom testimony. No jury deliberation. No opportunity for cross-examination. And as a result, much of the investigative detail remains within law enforcement files rather than being fully tested in a public trial setting. What remains instead is an official investigative conclusion. Built from evidence collected during the search. But even with that conclusion, the case is marked by its limitations. Not all of Alexis Gabe's remains are recovered. There is no complete reconstruction of every moment that occurred after she left her home on January 26. And without a trial, there is no formal legal record that answers every question the public still has. No courtroom confession. No final defense. No verdict delivered by a jury of peers. Only the investigative findings. Despite those limitations, law enforcement continues to publicly maintain their position. Based on the totality of evidence, investigators state they believe Marshall Jones killed Alexis Gabe. And for Alexis' family, that conclusion brings a difficult kind of closure. Because while it answers part of the question, it does not return what was lost. In the aftermath, memorials and tributes to Alexis continue. Her name is remembered in community vigils, online tributes, and family-led efforts to preserve her memory. Her father, Gwyn Gabe, continues to speak publicly about his daughter. Not as a case file. Not as a statistic. But as a person who should still be here. And beyond the details of the investigation, the case leaves behind a broader, more uncomfortable reality. Because for many who followed the story closely, one theme stands out above everything else. Intimate partner violence. The danger that can exist behind closed doors. The warning signs that are sometimes missed. And the escalation that can happen when a relationship turns volatile. This case did not begin with a stranger. It began with someone Alexis once trusted. And that is what makes the story of Alexis Gabe so difficult to process. Because the danger was not distant. It was personal. And by the time anyone realized the full extent of what was happening, it was already too late. Alexis Gabe was only 24 years old. She loved music, fashion, spending time with the people closest to her. And according to family and friends, she had a personality that naturally drew people in. She wasn't someone who disappeared without explanation. She wasn't someone who stopped responding to the people she loved. And because of that, her absence was immediately felt. Whatever happened in those final moments, Alexis deserved far more time than she was given. Far more life. Far more memories. Far more future. Cases like this leave behind difficult questions. How many warning signs are missed in relationships that appear normal from the outside? How often do families recognize danger before there is anything they can legally do about it? And what happens when the only person who truly knows what occurred is never able to stand in court and answer for it? For Alexis Gabe's family, the pain did not end when investigators identified a suspect. Because closure and justice are not always the same thing. One can come from answers. The other comes from accountability. And in this case, accountability never reached a courtroom. As of today, law enforcement considers the case effectively resolved based on investigative findings. But not every question has been answered publicly. Not every detail has been explained in full. And not every piece of Alexis' story has been recovered. Her family continues to honor her memory. Not as a headline. Not as a case number. But as a daughter, a sister, and a young woman whose life mattered deeply. And across communities and online spaces, her story continues to be remembered as part of a larger conversation about domestic violence, missing persons cases, and the warning signs that are too often overlooked. Thank you for spending this time with me today. These stories are real. The victims are real. And the families left behind carry these losses every single day. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Dark Case Files. It helps this channel continue telling these stories carefully, and with respect for the people at the center of them. And I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe investigators uncovered the full truth in the Alexis Gabe case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time. Stay curious. Stay aware. And stay safe.